Okay, students, we're on Chapter 18, Political and Cultural Conflict in a Decade of Depression and War, the 1890s. Political and Cultural Conflict in a Decade of Depression and War, 1890s. Section 18.1 is Frontiers at Home, Lost and Found. How did fears about closing the Western frontier affect American political, social, and cultural life in the 1890s? And the search for domestic political alliances. What coalitions and institutions were created and strengthened in an effort to unite diverse groups in common purpose? The third section has to deal with American imperialism. How did different groups define, and in some cases, further American interests abroad? We're going to see through the course of American imperialism, racism as well, in Cuba and in the Philippines, as well as China. The American Empire, these are the key topics for this chapter. A coup in Hawaii, the Spanish-American War, and war in the Philippines. Frontiers at Home, Lost and Found, claiming and managing the land, the tyranny of racial categories, new roles for schools, and connections between consciousness and behavior. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a thesis that he presented at the Chicago World Exposition, where he stated that American history was shaped by the settlement of the West. In 1890, the frontier had disappeared, and there was American exceptionalism, which has somewhat disappeared over the last, say, during the Obama administration, where Americans weren't considered to be exceptional. Frederick Jackson Turner made a good point, saying that American history was shaped by the settlement of the West, because no matter how far back the West was pushed, far geographically, is that, yes, it was shaped by settlement of the West. Certain concerns, manifest destiny, for one, which was the Great Movement West, and the buying of Louisiana in the Louisiana Purchase. The government role in Western lands. In 1890, there was the Territory of Oklahoma. Then in 1891, there was the Court of Private Land Claims. And we start to see the development of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which would actually inspect meat and make sure that farmers were producing what they needed to produce in order to keep the United States viable economically. There was a balance between conservation and preserving, and you can read about Gifford Pinchot and John Muir in your books. The Territory of Oklahoma would become a state in 1907. It was known as the Sooner State. Sooners were people who rushed to claim the land. The Court of Private Claims was created to oversee land disputes in New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona, and it favored European Americans over Hispanics. The U.S. Department of Agriculture provided information and services for farmers. The balance between conservation and preserving. In 1890, there was a national park proclaimed in the Yosemite Valley. And in 1891 was the Forest Reserve Act, which set aside forest reserves in the public domain. Logging companies could exploit areas for timber. Now, Gifford Pinchot was a natural resource conservationist, and he managed forests could provide lumber, then they can be renewed, so it's a renewable resource. John Muir founded the Sierra Club in 1892, and he was devoted to preserving wilderness, regions saved in the natural state with no dams, mines, or logging allowed. Later on, Teddy Roosevelt would take up this cause when he became president of the United States. Now, this map is from Indian reservations. 1900, the Dawes Act, passed by Congress in 1887, intended to abandon the reservation system and integrate Indians into mainstream American society, as we saw in the last chapter with Indian schools. Nevertheless, many reservations remained intact. As a group, Indians lived apart from European Americans. By the early 20th century, the Indian was a vanishing race and had become a familiar theme in novels and films. Yet Indian activists continued to press the cause of their people to preserve native cultures and at the same time protest persistent poverty. The Indians argued that because they were placed upon these reservations, they were left to their own devices and they could not produce. How did Congress and government policymakers manage and develop Western lands in the 1890s? Well, we'll get to that. Designations for humans, ranking of races, some superior to others. They were defined by natural characteristics such as skin color, facial bone structure, and intelligence. We divide them into like Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. There were racial differences or actually cultural differences. So you see the distinction there. Social theorists gave scientific approval. They used to disenfranchise black men in the South, and they were used by the Supreme Court for prejudicial views in law. White terrorists used to justify mob violence against blacks. Now, when we look at the scientists agreeing with them, there was a theory that came up that I spoke about with Margaret Sanger in the last chapter. That was eugenics, and that's breeding unwanted traits out of a particular race. Causes of new interest in the idea of race: American efforts to colonize new areas. We're going to talk about that in the age of imperialism in the late 1890s. Brought into contact with darker-skinned people other than blacks. New immigration from Eastern Europe raised concerns about citizenship for non-Anglos, Russian Jews, Poles, and Italians. A lot of the Russian Jews, as I discussed earlier, left because of pogroms that were going on, which was government-sanctioned discrimination against the Jews. Disagreements with various U.S. groups. The U.S.-Mexican border, always a scene of dissension and disagreement. Indians in the West, African Americans in the South. In 1896, there was a court case that started here in Louisiana. It was known as Plessy versus Ferguson, and it determined that Jim Crow laws and segregation were legal. It had to do with a guy by the name of Homer Plessy, who was buried in St. Louis No. 1 in the St. Louis Cemetery. Plessy got on a train. If you know what a sleeper is, it's where you sleep on long journeys. The white part of the sleepers were in very good condition, but the black parts were not. They were dirty. They were just, it's a place to lay your head down. And Plessy decided he was going to sue to get equal conditions, and he wound up losing his suit. We start to see an upswing in lynchings. Ida B. Wells, accusations against black men were just an excuse to murder them. And white men resent that they no longer have slaves. And that is the truth. And I'll explain that to you very simply. A lot of times when a woman would scream that a black man sexually assaulted her, whites would take that as evidence, and they would generally lynch someone who was accused of that. Now, let's go back before the Civil War, or during the Civil War, for instance, when women were on plantations by themselves. Not one rape occurred as a result of them being alone. So, if we go to after the Civil War, we start to see that it's just an excuse to lynch black men, because after the Civil War and during Jim Crow and in the 1880s and 1890s, blacks were seen as sexual beasts, and that wasn't the truth. Now, sometimes a woman would want to cover up an affair that she may have had with a black man, and if it didn't go well, she'd scream rape. All right, which was not fair, but that's what happened during that time. If we look at this cartoon, we see it's an 1892 political cartoon, and it's entitled The Political Pinkertons, and it portrays the Ku Klux Klan members and poor whites as vigilantes bent on preventing Southern black men from voting. The artist compares these vigilantes to the Pinkertons, the private security forces hired by employers to intimidate workers who went on strike. So it not only pervaded political life, it pervaded personal life as well. And these cartoonists would make would have a great influence on people's thinking during this time. Schools reinforce distinctions seen as a means of upward mobility. See, schools were seen as a means of upward mobility, and immigrants embraced schooling because they wanted to advance. This is not a period where people are just coming here to escape. They have to make their lives a little bit better, and they can only do it through schools. Grouped by culture and class, we see segregated schools, race and religion. Catholic schools appeal to some immigrant groups. Trade schools for blacks and Indians. We discussed the Carlisle, kill the Indian, save the man. Remember that slogan? And middle-class families allowed children to prolong schooling. They're not dependent on children working to contribute. The poorer class families have to have people working so that they can, the family can survive. High school, logical extension of grade school, private institutions for the wealthy, Stanford College and the University of Chicago. We see African American leaders disagree. Booker T. Washington, you go along to get along, whereas W.E.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk wrote that, racism is taught, it's not inherent. We start to see college life with unique activities, teams like football and basketball games. And when basketball first came into being, the bottom of it was a basket. It was a peach basket, and it still had the bottom in it. So every once in a while, when somebody scored a goal, somebody had to get a ladder, get up, and get the basketball out. That's before they actually discovered, hey, maybe we ought to put a hole in the bottom. Okay, so here is a middle-class Powhatan family in Virginia poses for a camera around 1900. Since the 17th century, the Powhatan had intermarried with the Nanticoke of Delaware, as well as African Americans of the mid-Atlantic region. Communities such as these defied the efforts of scientists and others to rigidly categorize people according to race. We start to see a lot of racial overtones here, undertones. As a matter of fact, when people started to be classified according to their race. Racial discrimination violence at the turn of the century was countered by an anti-lynching crusade and demands for civil liberties led by individuals such as Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Ida B. Wells was basically a newspaper columnist, and she was chased out of Memphis, Tennessee, because that's where her office was, and people were threatening her with lynching if she continued her articles against lynching. So she had to flee. But she wrote a book called The Horrors of Lynching and Other Crimes, I believe is the name of it, and it was a very good book. It talked about the white justification for lynching, which is nothing. They didn't have one. Compare and contrast the various school systems established during the last quarter of the 19th century. Well, you saw we have segregated schools, there are white schools, there are black schools, and then you have immigrants taking advantage of free education. My grandfather was born in 1905, and when he was 13 years old in 1918, he had to quit school. Why? Because he couldn't afford to buy the books. You had to buy the books, you see, in order to attend the school. And he was a high school dropout at 13 years old in the 8th grade. He managed to go on. He had a very spectacular gift for math. The man was only about maybe 5 foot nothing, and had a gift for math, but he had the heart of a lion. He was just so big in stature, not in stature, but big in heart, that I'll never forget him. In fact, he taught me his love of history. He actually created that within me. The interior frontier, the psychology. Interior frontier, we're talking about the human mind. Sigmund Freud was in Vienna, and he basically used the adage that it was all sexual or having to do with your mother as to why you are the way you are. William James at Harvard University was, you can read about him in your book. William James believed that the mind was constantly adjusting to the environment. And that's true. Your mind is constantly adjusting to your environment. He wrote The Principles of Psychology. Stephen Crane wrote the book The Red Badge of Courage and explores the fears and self-delusions of a Union soldier. He avoids political issues, but he used first-hand descriptions in order to describe the combat scenes. Kate Chopin wrote a book called The Awakening. It prompted outrage The main character commits suicide rather than to submit to conventional life of being a wife and a mother. And then, being a wife and a mother, back then, what did you do? I mean, there was a sexual liberation in the 1920s that we'll talk about a little bit later. And of course, religion. Mary Baker Eddy, she formulated the Church of Christ. She was a scientist. Physical illness was a sign of sin, and faith healing with prayer. Now, Christian scientists believe that if someone gets sick, that you use prayer, the power of prayer, to either heal them or it's God's will if they die. Well, I believe that if God didn't intend us to have the knowledge to cure someone, to heal someone, He wouldn't have given it to us. Resorting to totally faith in God, that's all well and good. I'm a God-fearing man. I'm spiritual. But if the doctor can heal you, then he is working with God's hand to heal you. There was class conflict. The rise and demise of the populace would fade away. Those are the ones that believe that the government should share the wealth. There were barriers to U.S. workers' political movement, and there were challenges to traditional gender roles. Now, I'm not talking about what we have today where people, I'm born a woman, but I want to be a man and vice versa and all that. No. We're talking about in the workplace and sexual freedom. Women were starting to learn that, hey, I don't have to marry just for money or security. I can marry because I'm happy with this person sexually or other means. So the gender roles began to change. And also, when World War I comes around, you start to see women taking, like I mentioned in the last chapter, jobs that men had. Before World War I, there was no such thing as a female secretary. They were all male secretaries. And so the gender roles basically were not split, but they started to change. There were class differences. The wealthy and conspicuous consumption. There were expensive tastes of the ostentatious rich. Now you got to remember, this is before income tax. Income tax was a progressive move to share the wealth. So these people who had gotten their wealth could spend it on whatever they wanted to, but they kind of went overboard in this point. It's also known as the Gilded Age. The poor labored under hard circumstances. There was a prosperous middle class and the hope of unity through schools, museums, and libraries. Now, the middle class builds societies because that's basically your tax base. Okay? Middle class has to remain happy. They have to remain happy. If they don't, they refuse to pay taxes, the rest of the government's going to crumble. Now, that's not saying that poor people and rich people pay taxes, but the middle class take on the substantive part of paying income tax. There was attempts at the equality of opportunity. The government and voluntary associations can play a role. Remember, I said for the poor, there were no government programs that would take care of them. So they had to rely on private charities to do that, and that takes donations. You have to. That's how it runs. That's how you make it work. The Pension Act of 1890 provided a pension for all disabled men who served in the Union Army during the Civil War. Paid for with the McKinley Tariff. Now, President McKinley was the president. He would be assassinated in 1901, our third president actually to be assassinated. It was a high tariff on a variety of imported goods. It was supported by a variety of groups. This tariff, it's a tax. When you pay a tax on goods coming into the country, it's called a tariff. Northeastern states were dependent on domestic manufacturing. Western states, in return for Sherman Silver Purchase Act, the government promised to buy 4.5 million ounces of silver each month. That's a lot of silver. And issue banknotes that could be redeemed in silver or gold. Gold and silver has climbed within the last few years. Gold, I'm not sure. I think last time I checked, it was like $1,700 an ounce. That's a lot of gold, especially if you own a big ring. Now, what are the results of these tariffs coming in? Well, they hurt customers, and wages did not keep up with prices. You see, the cost of living tends to go up. Wages don't keep up with them. So you look like you're making less money, but actually you're making the same amount of money at a job. And then the cost of living hits you, and you're paying more for the same goods that you were before. Workers revolted. In 1892, there was a strike at the Carnegie plant, the steel plant. And then in 1893, the Western Federation of Miners, especially the Irish, the English, Mexican, and Chinese, went on strike for union recognition. So what happens when they go on strike? Well, they don't belong to a union, so you can get rid of them and bring in other people. So they lose their jobs. Violence erupted when mine owners brought in strikebreakers, and troops were sent in. And there was a new organization arose from the defeat. Now, we also had the gold standard that was attacked. And let me explain that. When you have, for instance, the money you have in your wallet, the paper money you have in your wallet is a promissory note. And how that works is, if you have $10 worth of gold and you have a $10 bill, that's $10. It's equal to $10. It's equal. But what if you print more money and you have the same amount of gold? Well, that gold becomes, that paper money becomes almost worthless, even though the gold will hold its value. All right, and we were on the gold standard back then to equate with our money. We wanted to see a free silver expand amount of currency in circulation, and businessmen wanted to stay on the gold standard, because then you could basically, let's see, where was I? Then you can basically, you print more money, it'll cause an inflation, but eventually when you print less money, that money will be worth, that paper money will be worth the same with that amount of gold. If you print more money, it's inflation. And the worthlessness of that money becomes apparent when you go to the store. The dollar bill now is only worth about maybe 32 cents. So it loses its value. Okay, the Populist Party emerges. We talked about that. It emerged in the 1880s. The platform included to address economic inequalities, basically share the wealth. A depression hit in 1893. All right, James C. Coxey was an Ohio quarry owner, and what he did, he marched to Washington, D.C. with 5,000 men, and he protested the failure of the government to provide relief during the Depression. Well, you can't look to the government to bail you out. Number one, government does not create wealth. All right, it can't create wealth. You have to let the capitalist system do its thing. Laissez-faire. Let it do its thing. There was a Pullman strike led by Eugene V. Debs, who was sent to jail because he started the strike. And there was a protest cutting of wages by the company, reducing rents due on company-owned houses. President Cleveland sent troops to crush the strike, and it showed an alliance between business and government that troubled the workers. You see, there was the business and the government were working together to crush the strike. So when you're a worker and you look at this, you go, wow, the government and big labor are working together. What chance do I have, or my family has, to survive if that's the case? Again, go along to get along. In the United States versus E.C. Knight, ruled that the Sherman Antitrust Act applied only to interstate commerce, not to manufacturers. If you remember back a little bit, the Sherman Antitrust Act broke up all these companies, okay? And it applied only to interstate commerce and not to people who manufactured the goods, you see. Ruled in favor of the sugar trust that controlled 98% of the industry. So the sugar industry had 98% of that in their coffers. Now, if we look at this map, it demonstrates manufacturing in the United States in 1900. During the late 19th century, most manufacturing took place in the northeastern United States. Exceptions included flour milling in Minneapolis, the growing textile industry in the southern Piedmont, and the emergence of steel production in Birmingham, Alabama. So that shows you where the industry was located. Now, in the election of 1892, Grover Cleveland won over Benjamin Harrison, who I believe was the incumbent, James B. Weaver. Populist movement, if you notice, is not gaining any ground. In fact, it's losing it. And there was John Bidwell, who got 2.2% of the popular vote. for prohibition. Like I said, there was a movement to get rid of the alcohol in the United States, and that would not occur until 1919, after World War I. In the 1896 election, Republican William McKinley won. He received support from Mark Hanna, who was a wealthy iron magnate, raised large sums of money, and charged that Bryan, as president, would be bad for businessmen, bankers, and other creditors. William Jennings Bryan was the Democratic candidate. With McKinley's win, the populists faded, but it was a mixed legacy. William Jennings Bryan was a 36-year-old populist from Kansas, and he gave the Cross of Gold speech, which you can read about in your books. Conservative Democrats left the party or sat out of the election, also chosen by the populists as their candidate, William Jennings Bryan. With McKinley's win, populism faded. There was a mixed legacy, and it was short-lived interracial coalitions where whites and blacks got together and won some state and local elections, but they never could make a real dent in the national politics. So this is the election results. McKinley won 51.1% of the vote, and William Jennings Bryan, Democratic populist, won 45.5% of the vote. With William McKinley, we're going to see American imperialism, which means that the United States was looking to expand its influence throughout the world. Describe the rise and demise of the Populist Party. What were the major goals of the Populists, and how many of those goals became reality? Well, share the wealth. Okay, that didn't really work with taxation, but it worked with the alliances, because they formed those cooperatives I was telling you about, where they put everything they produced in one barrel, and then they sold it. They sold it, and then split the proceeds. So people that weren't producing that much got the same amount. Nobody really argued about it. This is, in 1896, Charles H. Epps, the city sergeant of Richmond, Virginia, ran for re-election. He distributed these cards to prospective voters. The cards suggested the masculine nature of politics at this time. This one doubled as a scorecard for the city's professional baseball team and carried advertisements for a local whiskey manufacturer and liquor and tobacco store. If you notice, there's not really that many. The government outlawed advertisements for tobacco. You don't see like Camel commercials or anything like that, or Marlboro commercials on TV. Discuss the major political campaigns, class conflicts, and party alignments in the 1890s. You can look for your book for a particular type of explanation. It wasn't pretty. New political parties popped up as issues became varied, and they didn't win much because they weren't organized that well. So we look at the women's movement next. The women's movement was merging two major groups to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Elizabeth Cady Stanton served as first president for 2 years, and there were contradictory impulses. National and international unity, let's get every woman the right to vote throughout the world, distance themselves from the poor, African Americans, immigrants, and labor classes. Well, they had poor women, didn't they? So there were women's clubs that focused on self-improvement, benefits to both families and society in general, and they lobbied politicians. Education, they were concerned with education and social welfare. They raised money for hospitals and playgrounds. Now what we start to see is mission homes and social settlements where poor people could go and get a place for the night. The San Francisco Chinese Mission Home was for women who were fleeing abuse, and there was a shelter for unwed mothers and abused girls. The social settlements, problems of the poor. I mean, you know, how do you go from becoming poor to something else, even moving up in social status? In the United States, that's more possible than anywhere else. Okay? It was staffed by well-educated women. Reached diverse populations, and there were critics of conventional gender roles. There was a challenge under gender relations. Emma Goldman rejected the idea that marriage should always be permanent, And the divorce rate increased between 1890 and 1900. Why? Because women discovered that they didn't have to stay with somebody if they were not happy. Critics of the conventional division of labor were Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who said women should work as equals to men. Housework should be divided and performed by specialists to free up women, because their role in society was a little bit more important. Changing role of men was not ignored. Theodore Roosevelt, our future president, worried that men lacked opportunities for the strenuous life. There was a masculine bravado was the key to American strength, was the key to American strength. So there has to be, men need to be men, and he believed women should be women, and that the movement was just, I don't know, he thought maybe a lot of men thought that women were actually going crazy, because of it. Cultural encounters with the exotic. This has to do with American imperialism and initial imperialist ventures. We went to war with Cuba, and then there was the Cuban-Filipino War of 1898, and then later we had the Philippine insurrection that was taken up by the Moro, who were Muslims in the Philippines. It was a guerrilla war, and there were critics of imperialism. And why do you have critics of imperialism? Because they believe that this American exceptionalism, we're bringing civilization to these people. Well, they've lived without us for thousands of years. Why should we put American troops in harm's way in order to bring this to them? So those were critics of imperialism. America was always fascinated with faraway places. Robert Peary, the explorer, and the Greenland Eskimos. They were stereotyped as darker-skinned, non-Christian peoples as primitive. So if we brought them Christianity, they wouldn't be primitive anymore, and we could bring civilization to them. Well, what if they don't want to? Then the United States said, hey, let's make them. Chicago's Columbian Exposition of 1893 brought that to the forefront. Photographers and artists rendered exotic scenes. People were interested in places that they had never been, and it was used to sell products and for entertainment. This is a photograph of the Greenland Eskimo. Minnick is his name. Is shown here soon after his arrival in New York City in 1897. When he was 7 years old, Minnick was devastated by the death of his widowed father, Quisick. The two were among 6 Eskimos brought to New York by Arctic explorer Robert E. Peary. Later in his life, Minnick spoke of his father to a newspaper reporter, saying, "He was dearer to me than anything else in the world, especially when we were brought to New York strangers in a strange land." So, it really didn't matter whether this gentleman was grieving for his father. He was going to be put on display. What was the importance of becoming an imperial power? Military necessity. The United States was building its navy in the 1890s after a gentleman by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan, an admiral, said that you need a strong navy if you want to be an imperialist power or if you want to be a world power. There was a dispute in Venezuela, a boundary dispute, and there were economic interests in Hawaii. And in 1898, we eventually annexed Hawaii because we needed naval bases in the Pacific. I'm not sure if it was because we thought there was going to be some wars breaking out in Asia that we wanted to get into, or the simple fact that we just wanted to grab all the territory that we could. In the 1890s, the United States began to adopt a more expansive foreign policy, emulating the British Empire and actually challenging European powers in various parts of the globe. In the Pacific, we challenged Germany. We never did go to Africa, but we were looking for, and in Spain, no, not Spain, Cuba and the Philippines, we were challenging Spain because they had, those were their territories. We were looking to expand into Cuba. Cuban nationalists staged an uprising. And the United States, specifically newspapers, used what was called yellow journalism, which is also known as jingoism. And what they do is they lie. It's basically what it is. They lie to get the citizenry riled up so that they will protest to the government to start a war. And that's exactly what happened. The Delome letter, and I can give you some information about the Delome letter, it was published in the published by William Randolph Hearst in his newspaper, the New York Globe, which is the main one that he wanted to sell newspapers, basically, so they lied about what was going on. Delhomme was the Spanish minister in Washington, D.C., and his letter was supposed to remain private. But Hearst, being the newspaper magnate that he was, and he wanted to sell papers, decided to publish it. The sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898 was one of the triggers that caused the United States to go to war with Spain in Cuba. The ship had been sent to Havana to evacuate Americans if it was needed. It exploded and sank in the harbor, killing 260 officers and men. Investigation showed it was an accident, but Hearst, in his newspaper, implied that the Spanish were responsible due to a mine that attached itself to the ship and exploded. The ship is still in Havana Harbor. Its mast was brought to Arlington Cemetery. There's been an investigation, and later conclusions point to a coal fire, because you needed coal to start the fire up the engines, and there was a fire that eventually led to the powder magazine, and the ship blew up. Ironically, this ship was actually headed to New Orleans after its duty in Havana for Mardi Gras. In April 29, 1898, war was declared on Spain, and there were several items at stake. The investment in the sugar trade and trade with the island, American power and influence in the Western Hemisphere. Those are the things that were at stake. Then the Congress passed the Teller Amendment, declared the United States would guarantee Cuba independence once the Spanish were driven from the island. And that's exactly what happened during the Spanish-American War. It only lasted 6 months. And it wasn't that long a war. In the Philippines, Commodore Perry had defeated the Spanish Navy in Manila Bay. And then Hawaii was annexed, because what that means is you take over a territory, they assume all your political politics, and you let them have home rule, but you're annexing that. And we needed a naval base in Hawaii. And when we talk about World War II, we'll talk about that, because that's where the attack came, at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Hawaiian residents are given U.S. citizenship, and it becomes official U.S. territory in 1900. Now, President McKinley sent 17,000 troops to Cuba. Their staging area was in Tampa, Florida. It was not very well organized. It was in summer. It was hot down there, and American troops were wearing wool uniforms. They invited disease, and that's what happened. But we won the war. We kicked Spain out of Cuba, and we kicked them out of the Philippines. Now, the one problem we had with the Philippines was that we had guaranteed them autonomy after the Spanish were kicked out. And so we decided that, no, we weren't going to do that. And that's when the Filipinos decided on a guerrilla war to fight the Americans. Teddy Roosevelt was a member of the Rough Riders in Cuba that actually walked up Kettle Hill. It wasn't at San Juan Hill, it was at Kettle Hill, and with a group of volunteers. He volunteered, he put this group together, and he was made a colonel. He resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to serve in order to do that. Our country meant a lot to him. It was known as the Splendid Little War. It was over in 113 days, and only 385 men died in battle, but many more died of disease because of the conditions. The picture you're seeing here is one that was drawn by an artist about the Maine that exploded and sank in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898. American citizens were outraged when Hearst had made it appear as though a Spanish mine had blown up the ship. This is a outline, the Spanish-American-Cuban-Filipino War of 1898. This is the Pacific Theater in the Philippines. This map shows the major battles and troop movements in the War of 1898. The United States sought to eliminate Spanish control of the Philippines and Cuba, and there were broader U.S. motives, included fear for the property rights of American sugar companies in Cuba and a desire for strategic bases in the Pacific theater. I always tell my students that when you want to know the background of an historical event, you always follow the money. This is the Caribbean theater of war, where we went to war and beat the Spanish in Cuba. And let's see if we can find... No, I can't find it on this map. Okay, so here, yeah, these are all, if you look up at the inlet set map, it'll show you Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. Where and how did the Spanish-American War unfold? It folded in Cuba, and it unfolded in the Philippines because those were Spanish possessions. The United States was protecting sugar interests in both the Caribbean and in the Pacific, and we wanted to prove that our Navy, the one that Alfred Thayer Mahan had advocated for, was powerful enough to defeat a European power. How did American territorial claims change between 1790 and 1900? Well, we didn't really, the claims that were made after 1790 were mostly on American territory. In 1900, they were off of American territory. Okay? We wanted to be a world power, and that's what happened. What were the domestic attitudes toward the new overseas empire? Well, the wars were considered justified by the American population, but the imperialism was not. Because of the simple fact, excuse me, that we were dealing with peoples that we had never encountered before. Excuse me. And we as Americans, that American exceptionalism I talked about, believed other races were inferior. What are the arguments for and against the practice of torture as a means of extracting information from enemy combatants? Well, we've gone through this basically, well, yeah, we've gone through it recently when we talk about waterboarding. If waterboarding a terrorist can save American lives, there's the argument for it. Waterboarding is considered cruel and unusual. Most people will say, well, you can't do that. Well, if that's the only way that you can get information from someone, then that's the only way you're going to get the information. You can't ask please sometimes. And torture was used extensively in the Philippines. Do you think that some Americans might have approved of the harsh interrogation techniques used against Filipinos primarily because the latter group belonged to a lighter-skinned race? Why or why not? I don't think American people knew about it. I'm not so sure they were going to know about it. And even if they did, with the racial and ethnic attitudes at the time, I don't think they would have disagreed with it, as long as it served American lives. Now, if you're torturing somebody just to torture somebody, no, that's cruel. You don't do that. If there is a purpose, then I believe the American people with their racial attitudes at the time probably would have approved. Contrast the United States' post-war actions in Cuba and the Philippines with the rhetoric of reform and equality at home at the same time. This is not that difficult. The post-war actions in the Philippines were more or less either you're going to do what we say or we're going to crush you. And the Filipino people would not put up with it. And that's why there was an insurrection. It was actually our first Asian war. As far as reform and equality at home at the same time, these are conflicting because not everybody agrees as to what should have been done. Okay? In 1898, the Anti-Imperialist League was formed. It was founded by Mark Twain, and they had different beliefs. They wanted hands-off and a self-determination policy and social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism, I think I discussed it before, has to do with the survival of the fittest in society. All right? The strongest survive. This seems kind of against the policies of an anti-imperialist league because, you know, then you're promoting equality for everyone, not just promoting American exceptionalism. In the 1900 election, William Jennings Bryan ran again. He was for the free silver, wanted silver to replace gold as a standard, and he condemned the U.S. presence in the Philippines. In 1900, McKinley was reelected, and Theodore Roosevelt was his running mate. He was the vice president. Theodore Roosevelt had become a hero in the war. And so he decided to capitalize on this, and he ran for vice president. The anti-imperialist debate that followed the Spanish-American-Cuban-Filipino War raised crucial constitutional issues concerning the morality and cost of acquiring and administering foreign territories. The question should have been, how many American boys is this going to cost? How many lives is it going to cost us to expand our influence? And that was the big argument, is why should we sacrifice American boys to achieve a certain standing in the globe? Why did the United States abandon its isolationist stance in the 1890s? Give examples of changes in U.S. foreign policy, including the Spanish-American-Cuban-Filipino War, as well as Latin American and Asian interventions. One of the things I'm not so sure that the PowerPoint mentioned was the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 in China. We sent some American Marines over there to defend the Americans that were there, and they wound up getting surrounded for 55 days in Peking. Was it worth it to intervene? If you look at it from a peaceful standpoint, if you want peace, you have to do this. And it becomes part of the American ideal and the American values. The stance of the United States, we were isolationists because we had a lot of problems at home. We had just gotten over a civil war. There was Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the expansion west, the problem with the Indians. We couldn't worry about it until the 1890s got there, because the American government and Americans in general thought we had the problems under control. And so that's why in the 1890s we decided to exert our influence elsewhere. Now that's all for chapter 18, and I would like you to read the chapter. I think we're going to go through 17, 18, and 19 within the next week and a half so that we can have a test on 3 chapters. If you have any questions, please feel free to message me through Canvas. I check my messages every day, sometimes 5-6 times a day. And if you have any questions about what you're reading, please do not hesitate to contact me, okay? So I will see you in chapter 19.